Imagine walking into a courtroom, expecting justice, only to be insulted by the very person who is supposed to uphold it. That's exactly what happened when a corrupt judge crossed the line with J.D. Vance. But just minutes later, something shocking happened that no one saw coming. He ended up in handcuffs. What led to this incredible turn of events? Stay tuned to find out. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. J.D. Vance sat in the waiting area of the courthouse, tapping his fingers nervously on the hard plastic chair. A former Marine, he wasn't accustomed to feeling nervous in public places. But the tension in the air today was palpable. Today, he wasn't just here for any ordinary case. He was a witness in a high-profile trial concerning financial transparency. And as much as he wanted to remain just an observer, he could already feel the weight of the system pressing down on him. J.D. had spent years fighting for fairness, serving his country, and working hard in a corporate office. But in this world, his efforts often went unnoticed. As a man with a simple background, his education and military service were nothing more than qualifications that made him eligible for a seat at a table he was never truly invited to. He had seen his fair share of people being passed over, ignored, or even dismissed because they didn't fit the right mold. And today, he was about to face it again. The moment he stepped into the courtroom, he felt it, a cold, dismissive gaze from the clerk behind the counter, a young woman who barely acknowledged his presence. He nodded politely, but her eyes lingered, scrutinizing him in a way that made him feel small. As he made his way to the witness stand, his eyes met those of the defense attorney, who gave a curt nod. They didn't have much to say, they knew the deal. J.D. wasn't the one anyone cared about here. Then, Fan Davis, Judge Davis, made his entrance. The man stood tall, his robe billowing as he strode across the room with the authority of someone who had always been in control. He was the type who thrived on that power, his every move calculated, his every word measured, and when he looked at J.D., there was no mistaking the disdain in his eyes. J.D. could see it clearly. The judge saw him as a mere pawn in a game much larger than himself. "Mr. Vance," Davis began, his voice thick with condescension, "we're not here to talk about your military service or your so-called political achievements. This is about the truth, not your little resume." His words cut deep, as if he were stripping away the last remnants of J.D.'s self-worth. J.D. stood tall, but his heart sank. He wasn't just a witness today. He was a target. The judge's tone was a silent declaration that J.D. didn't belong here. The court proceedings continued with Davis's cutting remarks and harsh interruptions. J.D. stood there, biting his tongue, holding back the urge to snap. He had seen this kind of treatment before, but never quite like this. It wasn't just a simple case of being overlooked, it felt like a personal attack. The way Davis looked at him, like he was nothing more than a disruption in his otherwise perfect courtroom. J.D. was given little time to speak, as Davis cut him off at every turn. When J.D. tried to talk about the financial transparency of the defendant, Davis sneered, "Another conservative fairy tale about family values? Spare me." The courtroom fell silent, and J.D. felt every pair of eyes on him, as if he were being judged by everyone except the one person who mattered, the judge. But it wasn't just Davis's words that stung. It was the way the entire system was built to make people like him feel insignificant. The more J.D. tried to speak, the more the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in around him. He could feel the weight of the injustice, the subtle and invisible forces that pushed him down. As J.D. stood there, struggling to maintain his composure, he began to wonder if this was how everyone felt in these situations. If this was how people without power were meant to feel, small, invisible, and helpless. Then, just as J.D. thought the morning would pass without anything noteworthy happening, something small happened. The clerk, who had barely acknowledged his presence earlier, suddenly looked at him and shook her head slightly as if she had made a silent decision. She turned to the defense table and whispered something to the lawyer. J.D. didn't know what she said, but the chill that followed was enough. The moment was small, almost insignificant, but for J.D., it was the final confirmation. This wasn't just a random interaction. This was systematic. This was how things worked, how people like him were always going to be ignored and pushed aside. He wasn't just a witness in this trial, he was a part of the system that had been designed to leave him out. But JD wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt heavier than ever. As JD Vance took his place on the witness stand, his heart pounded in his chest. But he forced himself to stay composed. This wasn't his first time in a courtroom. But this was different. Today, it wasn't just the case he had to worry about, it was the system itself. He was facing an unseen adversary, an invisible force of power that threatened to strip him of any dignity he had left. As the court settled, all eyes turned to Judge Marshall Davis. The man's presence alone commanded authority, but JD could see the disdain in his eyes from the moment their gazes locked. Davis was a man who reveled in his power, someone who held the fate of others in his hands with no hesitation, no remorse, and JD was just another name on the docket, a name that didn't matter. Judge Davis took his seat with a dramatic flair, his robe sweeping the floor like a king on his throne. He looked down at JD with a smirk playing on his lips, as if to remind him of his place. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice laced with condescension. "Let's keep this simple, shall we? We're not interested in your political opinions today. Stick to the facts, if you can manage." JD's stomach churned. The words stung more than he expected. He had seen this kind of treatment before, people who believed they were above others. People who thought their position made them untouchable. But something about Davis's tone, his casual dismissal of JD, made him realize that this wasn't just about a case. This was about power, and the judge was using his power to make JD feel small. The clerk, who had been eyeing JD from the moment he stepped in, continued to passively ignore him, her cold stare cutting through him like a blade. She didn't need to say a word. Her indifference was enough. JD had learned to tolerate such things over the years. But today, it felt different. This wasn't just a petty slight, it was a reminder of his place in the grand scheme of things. He was insignificant. As the trial proceeded, Davis continued to demonstrate his control over the room. He interrupted the defense attorney multiple times, silencing objections without a second thought. JD could feel the weight of every word that came from the judge's mouth, as if they were calculated to crush his spirit. With every passing minute, the courtroom felt more like a stage for Davis to show off his authority, and less like a place for justice to unfold. Every time JD tried to speak, Davis shut him down. "We're not interested in your political fairy tales." The judge sneered when JD tried to speak about financial transparency. The words, the way they came out so easily from Davis's mouth, stung more than the slights he'd endured in his life. It wasn't just that he was being dismissed, it was the fact that his integrity was being questioned in front of everyone, simply because he didn't fit the image of those who were supposed to matter. The injustice of it all hit JD harder with every passing moment. He had been in tough situations before, he had fought battles in the military, had endured hardship, but this felt different. This was a systemic injustice, a force that he could not fight with strength alone. This wasn't just a man being rude to him. This was the power structure grinding him down, pushing him to the side, making him feel like he didn't belong. Vance looked around the room, his hands resting on the edge of the witness stand, his mind racing. He had spent his life in the service of others, believing that good would eventually triumph. But here, in this moment, it felt like there was no good to be found. Everything was weighed down by power, the kind of power that allowed people to get away with anything, no matter the truth. But then, something unexpected happened. The clerk, who had been indifferent up until this point, exchanged a brief glance with the defense attorney. JD couldn't catch what was said, but he saw the subtle shift in the room. There was a silent agreement between them, a silent understanding that JD was nothing more than a nuisance. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. This was not just about the trial. It was about how JD, and people like him, were treated in this system. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about a single trial or a single case. This was about a larger issue, an issue that had nothing to do with him personally, but had everything to do with the system itself. He was just a cog in the machine, and the machine had no place for people like him. The moments dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Vance tried to hold onto his composure, but his mind began to race. How many other people had faced this kind of treatment? How many others had been ignored, pushed aside, made to feel like they didn't matter? And then, just as he thought he might break, it happened. The final blow. Judge Davis, in his usual manner, interrupted the defense attorney once again, this time without a hint of subtlety. This court is not a stage for your political theatrics, Mr. Vance, he said loudly, looking directly at JD. It's time for you to understand your place. The words hit JD like a slap in the face. His dignity was stripped away in front of everyone, and he felt the sting of humiliation. For a moment, everything went silent. The world around JD blurred as he stood there, feeling the weight of Davis's words settle over him. The unfairness of it all was too much to bear. He had spent his whole life fighting for something better. But today, it felt as if everything he stood for was being erased in an instant. He wanted to speak, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all he could do was stand there, powerless in the face of overwhelming authority. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. No matter how powerless he felt now, he wasn't going to back down. He would find a way to fight back. And as the gavel slammed down, signaling the end of another round of the trial, JD realized he was no longer just a witness. He was part of something bigger, something that needed to be exposed. The battle for justice was just beginning. The tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point. JD Vance sat rigidly at the witness stand, feeling the weight of the eyes that were fixed on him, each one filled with judgment, skepticism, or worse, indifference. He had been here long enough to know how things worked, but the deliberate disregard for his integrity was more than he could tolerate. This was no longer just a trial, it was a battle for his dignity. And he wasn't going to back down. It had been a series of insults, sharp, cutting remarks from Judge Davis, each one designed to undermine his credibility. From the moment Vance stepped into the courtroom, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. But when the judge began to mock his testimony, dismissing his every word as if it were irrelevant, something inside Vance snapped. He had tried to stay composed, tried to remind himself that this wasn't personal, that it was just another day in court. But how much longer could he sit there, knowing that the system was rigged against him? Your Honor, Vance spoke up, his voice steady but filled with a quiet anger. I've been nothing but respectful throughout this trial. But I can't sit here any longer while you disregard the truth and twist the facts. I demand an explanation for your decisions. Judge Davis's eyes flickered with irritation. He leaned forward, the arrogance in his gaze unmistakable. Mr. Vance, he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. If you think for one moment that I'm going to entertain your demands, you're sorely mistaken. This is my courtroom, and I'll run it as I see fit. Your role here is to speak the truth, not to lecture me. Vance clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles white from the force. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He wasn't about to let Davis walk all over him any longer. I am speaking the truth, Your Honor, Vance retorted, and it's becoming clear that you have no interest in it. The courtroom fell silent as the two men locked eyes. Davis's face twisted into a grin, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. Is that so? He asked, his voice low. Then perhaps you should consider your place. Mr. Vance, you're a mere witness in this trial. Nothing more. You do not get to question my rulings. Vance's heart pounded in his chest. The injustice was so blatant now that it burned in his gut. Every word Davis spoke only confirmed what Vance had been suspecting all along, that the judge wasn't here to find the truth. He was here to control the narrative, to bend the law to fit his agenda. It wasn't just about this case. It was about power, Davis's power, and how far he was willing to go to maintain it. But Vance wasn't finished yet. You're using your position to manipulate the facts, to control who gets to speak and who gets silenced, he said, his voice rising in frustration. This isn't about justice. It's about you making sure that people like me are ignored, that the truth is buried. For a moment, the judge's expression faltered, but it was only for a moment. He quickly regained his composure and slammed his gavel down hard. Enough. I will not tolerate insubordination in my courtroom, he shouted. You will speak when spoken to, Mr. Vance, or I'll have you removed. Vance's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. He had come this far. And he wasn't going to let this system, break him. I'm not leaving until I've said what needs to be said, he replied, his voice firm. I'm not just here for the defendant. I'm here for everyone who's been silenced. For everyone who's been treated like they don't matter. The tension in the room was palpable. The gallery watched in stunned silence as Vance and Davis squared off. Two men locked in a battle of wills. Vance could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But there was something else as well, a sense of clarity. He knew now that this wasn't just about his testimony or his reputation. It was about something bigger. Something systemic that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Just as he thought he might gain some ground, Davis's next move was swift and unexpected. Without warning, the judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with contempt. You think you're above reproach, don't you, Mr. Vance? You're nothing more than a puppet for the political elite. And I'm done listening to your excuses. Vance's chest tightened. The judge's words were like daggers, cutting into him, but he couldn't let himself show weakness. Not now, not when he had come this far. You don't get to decide who's worthy of being heard. Vance shot back. You're supposed to serve the law, not use it to protect your own interests. The judge's face turned red, his breathing heavy as he gripped the sides of his bench. You're out of line, Mr. Vance, he growled. If you don't stop this, I'll have you removed from this courtroom. You'll never testify again. Do you understand? Vance stood tall, his gaze unwavering. If it takes me standing here and being silenced to expose the truth, then so be it. But I won't back down. Not now, not ever. And with that, the battle lines were drawn. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and the stakes had never been higher. Vance could feel the weight of the system pressing down on him. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He was determined to expose the corruption, to fight for the truth, even if it meant taking on the very person who was supposed to represent it. As the gavel came down once more, signaling the next round of proceedings, Vance knew that the fight had just begun. He had made his stand, and he wasn't going to let it end here. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The walls of the courthouse seemed to close in around J.D. Vance as the gavel came down once again, signaling the end of another hearing. Another day filled with insults, threats, and political games. His hands were trembling slightly as he gathered his papers. The weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just the case. It was everything, the mounting pressure, the growing sense of powerlessness, the feeling that he was being crushed under the weight of a system that didn't care about justice. Vance had fought for truth. He had stood in the courtroom, eyes locked on Judge Davis, refusing to be silenced. But in the end, what had it amounted to? Nothing. It wasn't long before he received the call that would confirm his worst fears. You're fired, his supervisor's voice said over the phone. We can't have your name tied to this scandal. You're toxic to the company now. His stomach dropped as the words sank in. His career, his livelihood, was over. All because he had dared to stand up against a corrupt system. All of his efforts, all his attempts to expose the truth, had only led to his downfall. He couldn't even get the justice he'd hoped for. Not from a court that had been so clearly compromised. He couldn't even protect himself. The damage was done, and no one seemed to care. The system was rigged. He was just another casualty in a fight that felt bigger than him. One he had no power to win. The media, too, had turned against him. News outlets were reporting that he was nothing more than a disgruntled whistleblower. Someone who was trying to stir trouble where there was none. Vance's personal agenda threatens trial. Read one headline. Another read. Vance's bias undermines credibility. They painted him as the villain. The one who was stirring up chaos in an otherwise legitimate case. And the worst part? Judge Davis wasn't just content with ruining Vance's professional life. He was actively working behind the scenes to destroy him completely. Vance knew that Davis had the power to manipulate the media, to make sure the world saw him as the enemy. And with that, any hope of clearing his name was slipping further and further away. As the weeks passed, the pressure became unbearable. Vance felt more isolated with each passing day. The people who had once supported him, or at least those who might have, were now distant. He was alone, struggling to make sense of a system that seemed designed to punish him for doing the right thing. But then, as if in response to his growing despair, a breakthrough came. though it wasn't the miracle he had hoped for. A fellow court employee, someone who had been quietly observing the trial from the sidelines, reached out to him. "I know what Davis has been doing," the voice on the other end of the phone said, its tone quiet, yet urgent. "He's done this before. He's been pulling the same stunts for years. You're not the only one." Vance listened, stunned, as the employee explained that Davis had used his position to destroy the careers of several others. All of them people who had dared to challenge him or get in his way. It was a pattern, a well-worn strategy that had worked for Davis time and time again. And now, Vance was just another name on a long list of victims. But the information was incomplete. And Vance knew it. It wasn't enough to take down Davis, yet. Still, it gave him something to hold on to. Something that could potentially give him the upper hand. He wasn't alone. There were others who had suffered the same fate. And together, they might stand a chance at exposing the judge's corruption. But it would take more than just words. It would take solid proof. And that was something Vance was still searching for. As Vance sat in his small apartment later that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen. He had once believed in the idea of justice. But now it felt like a distant dream. Something that only existed in stories and speeches. He had sacrificed everything, his career, his dignity, his peace of mind, only to be left with nothing but a hollow sense of failure. But then, as he sat there, staring at the stack of papers on the table in front of him, he realized something. He was not done yet. The moment of despair he had been feeling wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of his next move. The truth was still out there, hidden in the mountains of evidence that had been buried by those in power. The public was being misled, but Vance knew he could still turn the tide. All he needed was one breakthrough, one piece of evidence that would show the world what was really happening behind the scenes. He wasn't done fighting, but it wasn't going to be easy. Davis had nearly crushed him, and yet Vance knew that the fight wasn't over. He just needed to find the right angle, the right piece of evidence to tip the scales in his favor. But for now, he was stuck. The system had him in its grasp, and it wasn't letting go. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the window, where the darkened city lay stretched out before him. The weight of everything seemed to press down on him, but there was still a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the next move would be the one that would turn everything around. But it wasn't going to come easy, as the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. Vance took a deep breath. This wasn't over. It couldn't be, and he wasn't going to let it end like this. Vance had hit rock bottom. His career was shattered, his reputation tarnished, and his place in the legal world erased. Yet, there was a flicker of something in him that refused to die: determination. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about taking down the corrupt system that had chewed him up and spit him out. Vance knew that in order to have any hope of fighting back, he had to gather evidence. He had to find the truth that could bring Judge Davis to his knees, and expose the hypocrisy of a system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked for so long. So, with nothing left to lose, he began his mission. The first step was simple: get to work. Vance started combing through the cases Davis had handled. He didn't expect miracles, but every file he opened felt like a glimpse of a deeper conspiracy. There were inconsistencies in Davis's rulings, small details that didn't add up. It wasn't enough to prove corruption yet, but it was a start. Every night, he pored over case files and legal records, hunting for anything that might tie Davis to the manipulation of the law. But getting the evidence wasn't the only challenge. Vance needed allies, people who were willing to help him, and he quickly realized how difficult that would be. He reached out to a few former colleagues and even some people who worked in the courthouse, hoping for a break. A few of them seemed sympathetic, but as soon as he began to ask for help, he was met with hesitation and fear. The shadow of Davis's influence loomed over them all. One of the few who offered to help was Sarah, a court clerk who had seen firsthand the way Davis abused his power. She was afraid, but Vance could see the desperation in her eyes. She handed him a few files and whispered, "This is just the beginning. There's more, but you need to be careful. Davis doesn't take kindly to people like us." Vance nodded, understanding her fear. Still, it felt like a small victory. He now had more ammunition. And with each document, each piece of information, The puzzle was slowly coming together. But the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. The stakes had been raised. And it wasn't just his career anymore, his life was on the line. His next move was to confront someone who had been a constant thorn in his side, Greg. The court official who had been undermining him from the very beginning. Vance had a hunch that Greg was more than just an obstacle. Greg had known Davis for years, and Vance suspected he was part of the corrupt web that held the courthouse together. "Greg," Vance said one afternoon, his voice calm but firm as he approached him in the hallway. "I need to know what's really going on here. You know more than you're letting on." Greg's face hardened. He glanced around quickly, ensuring no one was listening. Then sneered, "You're out of your depth, Vance. There's nothing you can do. You're just making a fool of yourself." Vance's hands clenched, but he kept his cool. "You can't cover it up forever. People are going to find out what Davis has been doing. You're not going to get away with this." Greg's lips curled into a smirk. "You think you can scare me? I'm not the one who should be scared here." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "If you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Just walk away, before it's too late." Vance took a deep breath, knowing that confronting Greg was a dangerous game. But he couldn't back down. "It's already too late," he muttered, walking away. Despite the warning, Vance couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like every step he took toward the truth was met with more resistance. Every time he uncovered something useful, it was immediately dismissed or even erased. It was as if Davis had eyes everywhere, anticipating Vance's every move. His best lead, an email thread linking Davis to some shady dealings, had disappeared from the server overnight. His attempts to dig deeper were thwarted at every turn. Days passed in a blur of frustration and mounting fear. He thought he had finally found something solid, a recorded phone conversation between Davis and a mysterious figure discussing a case in a way that seemed suspiciously corrupt. The evidence was undeniable, or so he thought. As he prepared to release the recording to the press, something happened that shattered his hopes. The recording was gone. It had been erased from his files. And the backups had mysteriously vanished as well. Someone was always one step ahead of him. It was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Vance slammed his fist on the desk, the overwhelming sense of defeat threatening to crush him. He had nothing but the painful reality that the system, the very system he had trusted to serve justice, was rigged beyond repair. He had been trying to take down a man who had power beyond anything Vance could fight. But in that moment of despair, something stirred in him. He wasn't done yet. No matter how many times the system knocked him down, he couldn't let this be the end. The evidence had been wiped clean, but it wasn't gone forever. He had to find a new way, a new angle. Vance stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He wasn't going to let this break him. If the system thought it had won, it was wrong. There was still time, still a chance to strike back. The fight wasn't over, and this time, he would be ready. Vance's world had crumbled around him. Every attempt to fight back seemed to have been in vain, and the walls were closing in fast. His name had been dragged through the mud, his career destroyed by the very system that was supposed to protect him. But Judge Davis wasn't done yet. Vance had made the mistake of underestimating the depth of his enemy's power. Judge Davis, having tasted the power he wielded over Vance, decided it was time for the final strike. No more subtle moves, no more quiet intimidation. This time, Davis would come at him full force, using every resource at his disposal. The media, the law, and his influence within the courthouse. Nothing would stop him from ruining Vance for good. Vance had thought he could rely on his friends, on his allies, but now, even they were starting to fold. Sarah, who had once offered him support, pulled back when she realized the stakes. "I can't do this anymore. Vance, Davis will ruin me too. You're on your own," she said, her voice shaking with fear. It was a blow that struck deeper than any attack Vance had faced so far. Then there was Greg, the court official who had always been a thorn in his side. Vance had hoped that maybe Greg would change his mind, but that hope was dashed in an instant. "You should have known better than to mess with Davis." Greg sneered, his eyes cold. "You've crossed a line you can't come back from." With that, he turned away, walking off without another word. The isolation was suffocating. It felt like Vance was fighting a battle no one else could see or understand. The more he fought, the more the world seemed to turn against him. He was losing allies, losing hope, and worst of all, losing his own sense of control. But it wasn't just the people around him who were closing in. The legal system itself, the very institution Vance had once trusted, was now being used against him. He had been fired from his job at the courthouse. His name had been splashed across the media, painted as a troublemaker and a fraud. No matter where he went, there was a story about him. They all told the same lies, twisted the facts, and left him defenseless. Then, just when it seemed like the walls had completely fallen, a glimmer of hope appeared, though it came with its own set of risks. Late one evening, as Vance sat at his desk, scrolling through more files in a last-ditch effort to find anything that could turn the tide, he received a message. It was from someone he hadn't heard from in a while, Rebecca. A former colleague who had worked under Davis for years. She had always stayed quiet. But now, she had something to say. I know about the corruption. I know what Davis has done. And I can help. But this isn't something you can just wave in front of the press. You have to be careful. If you use this the wrong way, you'll end up digging yourself into a deeper hole. The message was short, but it was enough to get Vance's heart racing. Rebecca was willing to help. But the risks were immense. He didn't know if he could trust her completely. But right now, he didn't have many options. This was the break he'd been waiting for. Just as Vance was about to respond, his phone buzzed again. It was a call from Sarah. Vance, listen to me, she said, her voice trembling. I think they're onto you. You need to be careful. Greg. He's been talking to Davis. They know what you're planning. Vance's stomach dropped. Greg, the last ally he thought he had betrayed him. And now, everything he had been working toward was in danger of falling apart. But it wasn't just betrayal that Vance had to worry about now. He had to face the fact that the system was designed to protect people like Davis. Not people like him. No matter how much evidence he gathered, how many people he spoke to, it always seemed like he was one step behind. Davis was playing a game that Vance couldn't keep up with, not without more firepower. As the days went on, Vance tried to make sense of everything, but the walls just kept closing in. He couldn't trust anyone. Even his closest allies were retreating, leaving him to fight a war alone. He felt utterly helpless, like the world was against him and there was no way out. The weight of his situation was unbearable, and for the first time, Vance wondered if he should just give up. But then something changed. While going through one last set of documents, Vance stumbled across a critical detail, a small discrepancy in one of the old cases Judge Davis had handled. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Vance's heart race. If he could prove this one detail, it might be enough to bring Davis down. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. If Davis caught wind of this, it could be the end of him. In the midst of his desperation, another bombshell hit. One of his remaining allies, Rebecca, had been compromised. Vance, I'm sorry, but I can't keep going, she admitted over the phone. They've got to me. I never wanted it to go this far. But they've promised me protection, and you know how it works. I can't do this anymore. I've got to walk away. Vance hung up the phone, his thoughts spinning. It felt like everything he had worked for was falling apart. But he couldn't let go. Not now, not when he was so close. With renewed determination, he vowed to find a way. He couldn't let Davis win. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Vance sat in his small office, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The past few weeks had been nothing short of a nightmare. Every move he made was countered by Judge Davis. Every attempt to fight back crushed by the system that should have been his ally. His reputation had been dragged through the mud, and his career was hanging by a thread. But just when it seemed like there was no way out, an unexpected message arrived, one that would change everything. It was from someone he hadn't heard from in years. Rebecca, a former colleague who had worked with Davis for a long time, reached out to him with a cryptic message. I know what you've been through. I know what Davis has done. And I've got something that might help you. But it's dangerous. I'm not sure you're ready for the consequences. Vance's heart raced as he read the message again. Rebecca had always been one of the quieter voices in the office. A background figure who never drew attention to herself. But now, she claimed to have something that could turn the tables. The problem was, whatever she had, it came with a risk, one that could lead to even greater retaliation from Davis. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" Vance quickly typed in reply. "What evidence do you have?" A few moments passed before Rebecca responded. "I know about the cases he's buried. The ones that never made it to the public eye. And I know how he's manipulated the court system for his own gain. I've got proof, but if we go public with this, he'll come for you in ways you can't imagine." Vance sat back, staring at the screen. This was it. The opportunity he had been waiting for. But it came at a cost. The evidence could change everything. But using it could make him an even bigger target. He ran his fingers through his hair, thinking about the consequences. His mind flashed to his previous encounters with Judge Davis. How the man had never once shown an ounce of respect for him. Davis had buried every attempt to expose the corruption, manipulated the court's proceedings, and ensured that anyone who spoke out would be silenced. Now, it seemed, he had a chance to fight back. But it felt like playing a game where the odds were stacked against him. He picked up his phone and called Greg, one of the few remaining people he still trusted. "Greg, I've got a lead. Rebecca's got something on Davis. Something big." Greg was quiet for a moment before responding. "Vance, I don't know, man. This is risky. If we go down this road, there's no turning back. I don't have a choice." Vance replied, his voice firm. "I've lost everything already. I can't sit back and let Davis win." The call ended with uncertainty hanging in the air. Vance knew that he was taking a massive risk. But there was no way out. He had to act. The next day, he met Rebecca in a quiet coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of the courthouse. She handed him a folder with a few documents and some notes scribbled on the back. "This is what I've got," she said. "It's all here, the proof of Davis's manipulation. But once it's out, there's no going back. He'll come for you, Vance." Vance opened the folder, scanning through the papers. There were names, dates, and official records of cases that had been dismissed or altered in favor of those who paid the right price. The evidence was damning, but it was also dangerous. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that using this could be his only shot at redemption. But the consequences of failure were unimaginable. Back at his apartment that night, Vance sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents. His mind was racing, torn between his desire to do what was right and the fear of what might happen if he exposed the truth. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. He had already lost everything, his job, his reputation, his future. But if he exposed the truth, he risked losing even more. His friends, his allies, his life as he knew it. The stakes had never been higher. As Vance mulled over his options, a knock on his door broke his concentration. He opened it to find Sarah standing there, her face pale and worried. "Vance, I don't think you should do this. I know you're angry, but there's too much at risk. Davis isn't just a judge, he's connected. You can't take him down." "I have to try," Vance said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I can't let him keep ruining lives." Sarah looked at him for a long moment before sighing. "You're on your own with this, Vance, but I can't help you anymore. I've seen what he's capable of, and I'm not willing to risk everything I've worked for." The door closed softly behind her, and Vance felt a pang of loss. He had hoped that someone would stand by him, but in the end, he was the only one who could make this choice. The weight of the decision was suffocating. In that moment, Vance knew what he had to do. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let Davis continue to manipulate the system for his own gain. The evidence in front of him was his only chance, and if he didn't use it, he would forever regret it. But just as he made up his mind, a new message popped up on his phone. It was from Rebecca again. "Vance, there's something I didn't tell you. Greg, he's been talking to Davis. I think he's been feeding him information about you." Vance's heart sank. Greg, the last person he thought would betray him, had turned against him. Now, with his plans already in motion, the stakes had never been higher. As he stared at the message, Vance realized one painful truth. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. He was on his own. And if he was going to take down Judge Davis, he would have to do it alone. Vance felt the walls closing in around him as the weight of his situation grew unbearable. For weeks, he'd been planning his next move, trying to gather evidence, seeking allies, and finally preparing to take down Judge Davis. But he didn't expect the response to come so swiftly, so violently. It wasn't just the media, or the law, that he had to contend with now. Judge Davis had taken control of everything, using his power to destroy Vance once and for all. The first blow landed the moment the news broke. Vance had barely finished reading the message from Rebecca, a glimmer of hope in his heart, when his phone buzzed with an alert from the local news. The headline screamed, "Whistleblower accused of lying. Courtroom witness under investigation for false testimony." The article made it seem like Vance was a fraud, his testimony completely fabricated. His face stared back at him from the screen, looking like a man guilty of something he had never done. Vance's hands trembled as he read through the damning article, his heart sinking. The very evidence he thought would vindicate him was being turned into his downfall. He should have known. He had underestimated the power Davis wielded. The way he could manipulate the truth, the media, and the law itself. Davis wasn't just a judge, he was a master puppeteer, pulling strings in every direction, ensuring that anyone who opposed him would fall. Vance had been too focused on the idea of justice that he hadn't seen how deeply embedded Davis was in every corner of power. His allies, the people he had trusted, were slipping away, one by one. First, it was Greg, then Sarah, both of whom had quietly distanced themselves from Vance's fight. But the real blow came when C6, the one person who had promised to stand by him, backed out at the last minute. "I can't do this, Vance. You don't understand the reach he has. I'll lose everything," C6 had said, voice shaking. Before hanging up, Vance sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He felt the sting of betrayal, the isolation creeping in. His plan was unraveling before his eyes, and it seemed like there was no escape. Every step he had taken, every move he made, had been countered by Davis. It was as if the world itself was aligned against him. The phone rang again, this time with a number he didn't recognize. He answered with little hope. "Vance, it's Rebecca," the voice on the other end said, hurried and urgent. "I heard about the news. They've already begun twisting everything. But I have something that could change the tide." Vance's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Rebecca hesitated before continuing. "I don't know if you can trust it, but I found something. A document. A signed agreement between Davis and a few people he's been covering for. It's evidence of the corruption you've been trying to expose. If you release it, it could destroy him." Vance stood up, pacing back and forth. This could be it, the piece of the puzzle that could bring Davis down. But the risk was unimaginable. Rebecca was right. If he released this, Davis would stop at nothing to crush him. He had already gone so far, destroying Vance's career and reputation. What would he do next? "I'll meet you," Vance said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't back down now, not when he was this close. As he arrived at the small cafe where Rebecca had agreed to meet him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had already lost so much. But was this really worth the risk? What if Rebecca was wrong? What if this piece of evidence would only make things worse? Rebecca handed him a folder, her hands shaking as she did. "You need to be careful with this, Vance. It's not just about taking him down anymore. It's about survival." Vance didn't reply immediately, staring down at the folder in his hands. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about making sure Davis could never harm anyone again. But as Vance opened the folder and read through the documents, his heart sank further. The agreement was signed, clear as day, proof of the collusion, the manipulation of cases, the deals that had been struck behind closed doors. But there was a twist. The evidence wasn't complete. It was enough to damage Davis, but it wouldn't be enough to guarantee victory. Suddenly, everything hit him all at once, the frustration, the fear, the isolation. Davis had been several steps ahead of him all along. And now, even this final shot at redemption felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Just as Vance was about to speak, to tell Rebecca that he couldn't go through with it, the door opened, and someone else walked in. It was Greg, but he wasn't there to help. Instead, he was there to warn him. "Vance," Greg said, his voice low and heavy with guilt. "I've made a mistake. I was wrong to walk away. Before Greg could finish, Vance's thoughts snapped into focus. Something in Greg's expression gave him pause. His face was pale, eyes darting around the cafe nervously. He's already seen you, Vance. Davis knows. I've been feeding him information, Greg said, his voice shaking. He's going to come after you harder now. All of this, it's too late. Vance felt the world shift beneath his feet. The walls were closing in. He had trusted Greg, and now the truth was more devastating than ever. Suddenly, everything seemed like a hopeless, tangled web of lies. But in that moment, Vance also saw a glimmer of opportunity, the very thing that Davis had underestimated. Vance wasn't done yet. He still had a plan, a strategy, and a final chance to turn everything around. Vance stood up, his jaw tightening as he looked around at Rebecca and Greg. You've made your choice, Greg, but this fight isn't over. Not by a long shot. As he left the cafe, a sense of determination rose within him. He knew the consequences. He knew what was at stake. But the final move had yet to be made. And this time, he wouldn't back down. He would expose the truth, no matter what it took. The city was buzzing, the air thick with anticipation. Vance could feel the weight of what was coming, the pressure in his chest rising with each passing second. He'd reached the point of no return. No more hiding, no more backing down. The moment had arrived. It had all come down to this, the smallest detail, the forgotten piece of the puzzle that could bring Judge Davis to his knees. Vance hadn't planned for it to be this way, but life rarely worked out according to plan. He'd spent days piecing together what little he could, grasping at the edges of a truth no one seemed ready to hear. But now, he had something tangible, proof that could expose Davis's corruption, his abuse of power. He picked up the phone, dialing the number he had hesitated to call for days. The voice on the other end was familiar, but this time there was urgency in it. Vance, the voice said, low and careful, I think it's time. I've got the last bit of the puzzle. Vance's pulse quickened. You're sure? Yes, came the reply. The file. It's all here. Everything you need to bring him down. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. Vance's fingers tightened around the phone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. As he drove to the meeting place, Vance's mind raced. He could already imagine the scene, the crowded courthouse, the reporters, the eyes of everyone on him. The moment when he would stand up, face Judge Davis, and present the evidence that could change everything. But he knew that this moment was not just a chance for justice, it was also a risk. A final gamble. If Davis caught wind of what he was planning, there would be consequences. But that didn't matter anymore. Vance was done being afraid. Arriving at the small, dimly lit office, he found the figure waiting for him. The mysterious ally, C8, stood by the window, their face shadowed by the light from outside. Without saying a word, they handed Vance the file, the weight of it almost palpable in his hands. This is it, C8 said, their voice barely a whisper. Everything's in here, but you need to be careful. If Davis gets wind of this. I know, Vance interrupted, his voice steady. This ends today. The file was thick, filled with documents and photographs, evidence of Davis's dealings, shady court rulings, and illegal transactions that could ruin him. This was the smoking gun. But even as Vance stared at the pages, a nagging doubt tugged at the back of his mind. Was it enough? Could he really expose Davis with this? He didn't have time to second guess. The meeting was set for later that day, a public hearing. The kind where everything would be on display for the world to see. Vance had been granted the rare opportunity to present his findings to a room full of witnesses. But just as quickly as hope flared up, the weight of the situation settled back in. This was it, the moment of truth. When Vance walked into the courtroom, the energy was electric, every eye trained on him as he made his way to the front. The room was full of reporters, legal experts, and ordinary citizens, all eager to see what would unfold. But none of them knew what Vance had in his hands. Judge Davis sat at his desk, his face a mask of confidence, though Vance could see the tension in his eyes. It was a small thing, a flicker of uncertainty, but it was enough. Davis knew what was coming. He was just trying to keep his composure. Vance's breath caught as he stepped up to the podium. His fingers shook as he opened the file. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed, his heart thumping loudly in his ears. He glanced at the judge, who watched him with an almost palpable air of arrogance. But Vance could see the cracks beginning to form. The evidence was about to speak for itself. He started to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. Ladies and gentlemen, what I present today is not just a series of documents, but a truth that has been hidden for too long. Judge Davis, as you will see, has abused his power, manipulated the system, and ruined countless lives for his own gain. The room fell silent. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Vance could feel the weight of every eye on him. But he didn't stop. This was his moment. As he flipped through the pages, revealing photo evidence, bank records, and manipulated rulings, Vance saw Davis's composure start to crack. The judge shifted in his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his desk. There was fear now, real fear. The kind that only comes when someone knows they've been caught. Do you deny any of this, Judge? Vance's voice rang out, clear and cutting. Davis opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He hesitated, then forced a smile, trying to maintain control. This is nothing but an attempt to discredit me. Vance, you're desperate, grasping at straws. But Vance could see the fear behind those words. He could see the walls crumbling around Davis. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. A moment when everything that had been wrong would finally be exposed for all to see. But just as Vance thought victory was within his reach, Davis struck back, swiftly, ruthlessly. He slammed his hand on the desk, sending a wave of shock through the room. This man is a liar, he shouted, his voice thunderous. I will not let him destroy everything I've worked for. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. A chill ran through Vance as he realized what was happening. Davis wasn't just fighting back with words. He had one final card to play. And this time, it was going to be dangerous. The room buzzed with tension. Vance's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what Davis was about to do. But he knew it wouldn't be pretty. Just as he was about to speak again, Davis dropped the bombshell, a lie. A twisted version of the truth, designed to turn the tables and destroy Vance once and for all. As the courtroom descended into chaos, Vance knew the battle was far from over. It wasn't just about the evidence anymore, it was about survival. And this was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. The courtroom was filled with hushed anticipation. The atmosphere was tense, a palpable energy vibrating through the room as Vance stepped forward. His mind raced with thoughts of everything he had been through to get to this moment. For months, he had been searching for the right piece of evidence. The one thing that could finally bring down Judge Davis and expose the corruption that had festered for far too long. And now, with the help of the mysterious figure C8, he had it. Vance adjusted the papers in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He had worked with C8 to gather everything, an audio recording, video footage, and a critical witness statement that would expose Davis for the fraud he truly was. The pieces all fit together. And now, he had the chance to show the world the truth. He glanced at the jury, the reporters, the onlookers in the gallery, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually prevail. With a sharp exhale, Vance turned to face the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment pressed on him. What I am about to show you is not just evidence, it is the truth that has been hidden for far too long. He clicked the button on his laptop, and the audio began to play. The voice of Judge Davis, recorded in a private meeting, filled the room. Vance had already heard it 1,000 times, but hearing it now, in front of everyone, sent a wave of satisfaction through him. Davis's voice dripped with malice. The words unmistakable. We'll make sure this goes the way we want it. No one will ever know. The crowd was silent at first, processing what they had just heard. The courtroom hung in suspense. Vance could see the judge shift uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers twitching at his side. But this was only the beginning. Next, Vance played the video, a hidden camera recording of Davis meeting with known criminals, exchanging money for judicial favors. The evidence was irrefutable. The footage made it clear that Davis had been selling rulings, abusing his position for personal gain. The crowd gasped, some even standing in shock. Is this what we've been allowing in our courts? Vance said, his voice rising. "This is the man we trusted with our lives. This is the system we believed in." The judge's face went pale, and his jaw clenched as he stood up. "This is nothing but a smear campaign," he said, his voice shaking but trying to project authority. "You've manipulated these recordings. This is not the truth." But Vance wasn't fazed. "You know as well as I do that this is the truth. It's on tape. It's in writing. You can't deny it anymore." The room erupted into whispers. Davis paced back and forth, clearly rattled, but every move he made seemed like it was only digging him deeper into the hole. His attempts to deny the evidence only made him look more desperate. And the truth hung in the air, undeniable. His empire of lies was crumbling. As the minutes passed, the tension in the room mounted. The media, who had been watching closely, began to turn against him. Their cameras shifted focus, their stories already beginning to change. And it was no longer just the media. The court's officials, those who had once been loyal to Davis, started to exchange uneasy glances. One by one, his allies began to shift their allegiance. They didn't want to be part of the corruption any longer. The weight of public opinion and the undeniable evidence began to work against Davis, and he could see the loyalty of his supporters eroding before his eyes. Desperation began to seep into his voice. "You think this will change anything? You think this will destroy me?" he spat. "I've got more power than you could ever imagine. You're nothing compared to me." But his words were hollow. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The courtroom was a battleground, and Vance was finally standing in the light, while Davis was sinking deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a group of officials entered, government representatives, the media's top executives, and members of the Judicial Oversight Committee. They had been watching from the sidelines, and now, it was clear that they were here to act. One of them stepped forward, looking directly at Davis. "Judge Davis, you're under investigation. Your actions will be thoroughly examined. The truth will be uncovered, and you will be held accountable." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Davis's face fell, his bravado shattering. His power, once unshakable, was now slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Vance felt a sense of triumph swell within him, but it was tempered by the gravity of the situation. The battle wasn't over, not yet. Davis still had connections, and the system was still deeply flawed. But for the first time in a long time, Vance felt as though he had won. The truth had been exposed, and that was a victory in itself. He looked around the room, his gaze meeting those of the people who had stood by him. And then at the judge, whose face was now a mask of defeat. "This is just the beginning," Vance thought, as the final pieces of Davis's empire began to crumble. The fight for justice wasn't over. But for the first time, Vance felt as though it was within reach. The courtroom was a sea of mixed emotions: relief, disbelief, and lingering doubt. The atmosphere was charged with tension as Judge Davis sat at the defendant's table. His face pale, his back straight, yet his shoulders slumped under the weight of the truth that had been thrust into the open. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and despite his attempts to deny and deflect, it was clear that his reign of corruption had come to an end. But even in the face of public defeat, Davis was far from finished. As the judge rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the room, it was clear he wasn't ready to give up yet. He had been humiliated, but the fight wasn't over for him. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, his mind racing for a way out. "I will not be destroyed by this. You all don't know the full story," Davis muttered, his voice low but filled with a quiet fury. Vance watched, his heart pounding in his chest. The justice he had fought for, the truth he had exposed, it was all right in front of him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the background. Davis was down, but was he really out? In a last-ditch effort, Davis's lawyers approached Vance with an offer. They tried to negotiate, to convince him that the consequences of further public exposure would ruin not just Davis but anyone who had crossed paths with him, including Vance. "You've made your point," one of Davis's lawyers said, his tone smooth, almost pleading. "But you don't want to destroy everything. Take the deal, and this can all go away." But Vance wasn't swayed. He'd come too far to back down now. The truth had to be heard, no matter the consequences. However, Even though the evidence had been laid bare, there were still those who chose to protect Davis. Some of his allies, their own interests tied to his, continued to stand by him, stubbornly denying the reality that was now so glaring. The system, it seemed, was reluctant to let go of its corruption. Some turned their backs, but others stayed in line, willing to sacrifice their integrity to hold on to their power. And in the midst of it all, Vance had to face the choices that lay before him. This wasn't just about defeating one man anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. But could he fight that battle? Or would he be content with the partial victory he had just won? As the media swarmed around, reporting every moment of Davis's downfall, Vance couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his stomach. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. The corruption was deeper than he had ever realized. He had exposed one part of it, but how many other pieces of the puzzle remained hidden? Vance stood alone at the center of the storm, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could see the faces of those who had once supported him, the allies who had backed away in fear, the colleagues who had turned their backs in the face of danger. Among them were C5 and C6, who had once been his strongest supporters. They had abandoned him, unwilling to risk their own futures for his cause. They had made their choices, but Vance had to decide if he would ever be able to forgive them for their betrayal. But the deeper he thought about it, the more he realized that forgiveness was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. The battle for justice wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It was bigger than the individual betrayals and setbacks. Vance knew that even if he exposed Davis, even if he brought this man to justice, there would still be more to fight. He couldn't stop here. In the days that followed, the fallout from Davis's public defeat was inevitable. The media turned on him, and the public outrage grew louder. But not everyone was satisfied. There were still whispers in the halls of power, and there were still powerful figures who sought to protect their own interests. No matter the cost, Davis was only the tip of the iceberg, and Vance knew that the system that had allowed him to rise to such heights of power was still in place. But as Vance watched Davis's downfall unfold, he felt something shift within himself. He wasn't finished yet. No matter what the cost, he had to keep pushing. He had to find a way to keep fighting, to keep exposing the truth. This wasn't just about one judge, it was about the corruption that ran deep through every level of power. And in that moment, Vance understood something crucial. This was not just his fight. It was the fight of everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had suffered under the weight of a broken system. The real battle had only just begun. Vance sat alone in his office, staring at the cityscape outside the window. The once bustling streets now seemed quieter, almost subdued in the aftermath of the battle he had fought and won. The fall of Judge Davis was a victory, one he had worked tirelessly to achieve. But as Vance reflected on the journey that had brought him here, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. When he first set out on this path, it was personal. It was about standing up for what was right, for protecting himself from the corruption that threatened to swallow him whole. But now, after all the chaos, all the sacrifices, he realized that it had become something much larger. This was no longer just about him. It was about a system that had failed so many for so long. He had lost much along the way. His career, his reputation, even his sense of security. But the price had been worth it, at least. That's what he told himself. Yet as he stared at the cold, unyielding skyline, he knew that the victory came at a steep cost. The system had been exposed, but it had not been dismantled. It was still standing, still functioning in the same broken ways. Justice has been done, he muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. The fall of Davis was significant, but there was so much more to be done. The legal and social systems that had allowed Davis's corruption to thrive were still intact. And Vance knew that they would continue to oppress those who had no voice. Despite the public outcry and the support from those who had rallied behind him, there were many who remained skeptical. They questioned the fairness of the system. They questioned whether this was truly justice or just another chapter in a long, corrupt history. Even his own victory had its critics, those who believed the fight wasn't over, that it would never be over until the entire system was reformed. Vance couldn't ignore these thoughts. He had come to understand that the fight for justice wasn't a single battle. It was a war that would take years to win. If it could be one at all. He had toppled one corrupt figure. But how many more were out there? How many more would continue to abuse their power while the system turned a blind eye? He stood up, pacing slowly across the room. The weight of his decisions, the toll it had taken on him, were becoming clearer with every passing day. He could walk away now, leave the fight behind and try to rebuild what was left of his life. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be enough. He had seen too much, felt too much. The scars of this battle would not fade easily, and neither would the nagging sense that he had to continue. The system needed more than just exposure, it needed reform. And that was a fight he wasn't ready to abandon. As the hours passed, Vance's mind raced with possibilities. He thought about those who had stood by him through thick and thin, C5 and C6. Who had offered their support, even when it wasn't easy. But there were others who had turned away, afraid of what their involvement might cost them. His heart felt heavy as he remembered the faces of those who had walked away. The ones who had chosen self-preservation over standing up for what was right. There was a knock at the door. Vance turned, his thoughts interrupted. C8, a familiar face, stood in the doorway, a hint of uncertainty in their eyes. "You've made it this far," C8 said, stepping inside, "but don't think this is over. You've won a battle, not the war." Vance's gaze hardened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. C8 hesitated before speaking again. "There's more to this than you think. Davis wasn't the only one in power. There are others, even higher up, who won't let this go. They'll come after you. They'll come after all of us. It's not over." The words hung in the air like a warning. Vance felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that the fight was far from over, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. C8's gaze softened, and they took a step closer. "You've sparked something, Vance. But if you want to finish what you started, if you want to bring real change, you'll have to make harder choices. You'll have to be ready for what's coming next." Vance nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the next phase of this fight. But he knew he couldn't stop now. The victory over Davis had given him a taste of what was possible. But it had also shown him how deeply rooted the corruption ran. As C8 left, Vance stood by the window, looking out at the distant horizon. A new chapter was about to begin. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But Vance had come too far to turn back now. The fight for justice wasn't over, it had only just begun. As we wrap up this incredible journey, one thing is clear: no matter how powerful someone might seem, justice will always find a way to expose the truth. J.D. Vance's story shows us the importance of standing up, even when the odds are stacked against us. It's a reminder that corruption can't hide forever. And sometimes, the fight for truth requires great personal sacrifice. What do you think? Should Vance have taken a different approach? Or was this the only way to reveal the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening content.